Economy is that way, honey. Down the aisle and to your right. The words came out smooth and practiced the way a person speaks when they have said something so many times it has stopped feeling like a choice. Bet Larson did not look at the boarding pass. She did not ask for a name. She looked at the woman standing in the jet bridge doorway, took in the charcoal cashmere sweater, the neat black joggers, the spotless white sneakers, the worn leather tote bag, and she made her decision in the span of a single breath. The woman did not respond. She stepped through the aircraft door, turned left into the warm golden light of the first-class cabin, and disappeared between the rows of private pods without a word. Betta Larson stared at the empty doorway for a moment. Then she turned to Sophia Reyes, the junior flight attendant, standing 2 steps behind her with a tray of pre-departure champagne glasses. Sophia had seen the whole thing. Her eyes were fixed on the spot where the woman had been standing. There was something in her expression that was not quite confusion and not quite recognition, but something in between. "Did you see that?" Bet said quietly. Her voice was not loud. It was the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that real authority never needed to raise itself. She did not even stop to say her name. Sophia did not answer right away. She looked down at the champagne glasses on her tray and straightened one that did not need straightening. "Go check on the beverage cart," Bet said, already moving. "I will handle this." Outside the aircraft, the world was doing what it always did on a humid Tuesday evening at John F. Kennedy International Airport. Terminal 4 was alive with the particular exhausted chaos of international travel at peak season. Rolling suitcases clattered across polished floors. Families argued over gate numbers. Business travelers walked with their eyes sealed to their phones, moving through crowds the way water moves through rock, finding gaps without ever actually seeing the obstacles. The air smelled of overpriced coffee and stress and recycled air conditioning that had been recycled so many times it no longer smelled like anything at all. At gate B24, the overhead display read Pinnacle Air Flight 112, London Heathrow. Boarding. The Boeing 777 sat at the end of the jet bridge like a patient animal, its navigation lights blinking slow and steady in the dusk. Ground crews moved beneath its wings in orange vests, and somewhere in the cockpit, 2 men were working through checklists that had not changed in 30 years. Inside the aircraft, the forward cabin was beginning to fill. The first-class section of Pinnacle Air's long-haul configuration was designed to feel like a private space. All warm, cream leather and indirect lighting and pod doors that slid shut to give each passenger a room of their own at 35,000 feet. It was a cabin that cost between $8,000 and $14,000 to occupy for the duration of the crossing. It was a space that carried in its every design choice a silent message about who was expected to be there. Bet Larson had been delivering that message for 27 years. She was 57 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of a woman who had long ago decided that her spine was a statement. She had started her career with Pinnacle Air when the airline was still a mid-tier regional carrier with 24 aircraft and a headquarters in Charlotte. She had watched it grow. She had grown with it. She had outlasted 7 senior cabin managers, 4 CEOs, and 3 complete uniform redesigns. The pin on her left lapel read 27 years of service in small gold letters, and she wore it the way other people wear military decorations, not as a piece of jewelry, but as a credential. Bet had a taxonomy. She had built it over decades without ever writing it down, which was part of why it had never been questioned. Older white men in tailored suits belonged in her cabin. Women with designer handbags and the particular controlled impatience of people who had never once waited in an economy boarding line, they belonged. Young tech workers with expensive laptops and wireless headphones that cost more than some people's monthly rent, they belonged even if she found them irritating. But a black woman in casual clothing with no visible status markers, no designer labels, no flight attendant following in her wake with extra luggage that was an anomaly. That was a problem waiting to reveal itself. Bet had been correcting anomalies for 27 years. She straightened her uniform jacket, checked the mirror near the galley entrance, and walked back into the cabin. At the gate podium, outside, a different kind of person was preparing to board. Douglas Harmon was 51 years old, and he occupied space the way certain buildings do not through any particular height or physical presence, but through a sheer force of projected importance. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that had been cut by someone in Mayfair who charged by the millimeter with silver cufflinks that caught the terminal light every time he gestured, which was often. His silver hair was slicked back with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested he had checked it in the last 15 minutes. He stood near the priority boarding lane with his AirPods and conducting what appeared to be a hostile acquisition negotiation with someone in a time zone that was already tomorrow. "No," he said. "Tell them to accept the terms or we walk. Their balance sheet is a disaster and they know it. I don't care about the severance. The regional offices were always dead weight. Cut them." He paused, listened, nodded once with the satisfied expression of a man who had never been told no by anyone he actually respected. "Just get it done before I land." He ended the call without a farewell and stepped up to the boarding scanner. He placed his phone against the reader without looking at the gate agent the way you might wave a key card at a door in your own building. The machine beeped green. He walked through. On his way down the jet bridge, he passed a woman walking slightly ahead of him. His shoulder caught hers as he accelerated past. He did not slow down. He did not look back. He did not apologize. Some people simply passed through the world at a speed that made apology impractical. He stepped through the aircraft door, turned left, and entered the first-class cabin. Back in the galley, Bet was pulling on her professional smile the way a person pulls on a glove, smoothing it into place before stepping back through the curtain. She had a plan. The woman in the cashmere sweater was in 1A, and Bet was going to walk over there and resolve the situation quietly, efficiently, and without making it a thing, which meant making it a thing before anyone had time to take out a phone. Sophia stood near the galley entrance, still holding the champagne tray. She was 26 years old and 9 months into her first international route assignment. She had grown up in San Antonio in a house where her mother worked double shifts and her father drove a delivery truck, and she had earned her flight attendant certification with a grade point average that put her at the top of her class. She was good at her job. She was good at reading rooms, at sensing when a situation was escalating before it had technically begun. The situation in 1A had technically begun. "Bet," she said quietly as the older woman moved past her. "Shouldn't we check the printed manifest first before—" "I said I will handle it," Bet replied, not stopping. Sophia stood alone in the galley doorway, champagne tray balanced on her palm, watching her supervisor walk toward the front of the cabin with the certainty of someone who had never once been wrong. She had a very bad feeling about the next 30 minutes. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if this story has you hooked already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. Let's get back to the story. The woman in seat 1A had chosen that sweater for a reason. It was cashmere. Yes. It had cost more than most people's grocery bills for a month. But it was also formless and gray and had no logo anywhere on its surface. The joggers were Italian and cut with a precision that most joggers were not, but on the body they looked like joggers. The sneakers were white and clean and entirely unremarkable. The leather tote was old, the kind of old that comes from actual use rather than the artificial distressing that luxury brands sold for $300 extra. Dr. Naomi Reeves had dressed herself this morning the way a scientist calibrates an instrument, with intention, with care, with a very specific outcome in mind. She was 42 years old, and her presence in seat 1A was not an accident. At 42, Naomi Reeves had the particular quality that certain people develop when they have spent decades being underestimated and have found a way to turn that into something useful. Her dark skin had the kind of deep, even tone that reads differently under different lights, rich brown in warm interiors, almost luminous under overcast skies. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat, elegant puff that she had worn the same way since graduate school. Not because she had not thought about it, but because she had thought about it and decided she was not interested in changing. Her eyes were the kind that recorded everything and gave away almost nothing. She was not famous. Her name did not appear in tabloids or on entertainment websites, but in a very specific corner of the aviation and logistics world, the name Naomi Reeves had a particular weight to it, the weight of someone who had walked into broken things and left them fixed. 3 weeks prior, on a Thursday afternoon, in a glass-walled conference room on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, Naomi had been formally appointed as the new Chief Operations Officer of Pinnacle Air. The airline had been in trouble for 4 years, and the trouble had been getting louder. Customer satisfaction scores had fallen to their lowest point in the company's 20-year history. Complaint logs were backlogged by 8 months. There had been 2 high-profile incidents in the past year, both involving passengers who claimed they had been treated differently because of how they looked. Both investigated internally, both quietly closed with findings of no policy violation. The board had been reading the same numbers for 12 months and finally arrived at the conclusion that something needed to change at a level that was deeper than a press release. They had hired Naomi. She had spent 15 years doing exactly this kind of work. Logistics companies in Germany, a regional airline in the UK that had been losing passengers to budget carriers, a cargo firm in Singapore that had managed to accumulate 17 active labor violations without anyone in senior management being able to explain how. She had a methodology, and the methodology began the same way every time. Before she walked into a boardroom with solutions, she walked into the operation as a customer. She wanted to see what the company looked like when it did not know anyone important was watching. For Pinnacle Air, that had meant 4 weeks of incognito flights on the routes with the worst complaint profiles. 17 flights in total. She had booked them all under her own name, but without attaching any executive credentials to her profile. She had dressed down every time. She had carried her own bags and waited in regular boarding lines and sat in first-class seats she had paid for at full fare and observed. In her leather tote, in a small notebook with a cracked spine, she had documented everything. The gate agent at Miami, who had asked her to rescan her boarding pass twice before accepting it while waving through the 4 passengers behind her without a second glance. The purser on the Boston route, who had accidentally but distinctly addressed every other first-class passenger as sir or ma'am and had called her honey. The meal service on the Atlanta flight, where she had been the last passenger served despite sitting in row 2. Small things, individual things, things that could each be explained away, things that assembled into a notebook across 17 flights told a very clear story about the texture of the experience being offered to passengers who looked like her. Tonight was Flight 17, the last one. Tomorrow morning, she was scheduled to land at Heathrow, take a car to Pinnacle's London hub, walk into the executive conference room, and put the notebook on the table. The real work would begin then, the hard, necessary, unglamorous work of changing not just policies, but the invisible architecture of expectation that policies grew out of. She had not expected Flight 17 to provide additional material. She was reconsidering that expectation. Naomi settled into 1A, which was a good seat in a well-designed aircraft. The pod door was open. The overhead bin was empty and large. She lifted her tote and secured it and sat down in the wide leather seat, letting out a breath that she had not quite been aware she was holding. Outside the window, the tarmac was wet from an earlier rain, and the airport lights were beginning to assert themselves against the darkening evening sky. She pulled the novel from her bag. It was a long book, a proper one, the kind that required actual attention. She had been reading it for 3 weeks and had not gotten as far into it as she would have liked, because 3 weeks ago her life had fundamentally changed direction. She found her page. Before she opened to it, she looked at the boarding pass one more time on her phone. The Pinnacle Air app. Her name, Naomi Reeves. Seat 1A. Flight 112. London Heathrow. She had booked this seat through the executive corporate office, which meant the ticket had been issued with the kind of internal coding that looked to any system querying it like a standard full-fare first-class purchase. She had specifically requested that no executive flag be attached to her passenger profile. She wanted to arrive as a person, not as a title. Before switching to airplane mode, she opened her messages and typed a single line to Diane Cole, her assistant, who was sitting at a desk in the Midtown office finishing the last of the pre-London briefing documents. Flight 112. We may need the protocol tonight. She sent it, set the phone face down on the armrest, and opened her book. She heard the gate agent's voice over the intercom muffled through the aircraft walls beginning the standard boarding announcements. She heard the shuffle and drag of rolling carry-ons entering the cabin behind her. She heard the particular quality of silence that first-class cabins produce, a silence that is not the absence of sound, but the careful management of it. And she heard very clearly the sound of unhurried footsteps moving down the aisle toward her. She turned a page. She had been here before. She knew how this began. She had 17 notebooks worth of knowledge about how this began. And she knew that what happened in the next 30 minutes would be recorded not only in the notebook in her tote bag, but in the memory of every person in this cabin. She wanted to see what Pinnacle Air looked like when it thought nobody important was watching. She was about to find out. Economy is that way, honey. Down the aisle and to your right. That had been the greeting at the door. Naomi had already logged it. Not with visible reaction, not with the sharp intake of breath that the words probably warranted, but with the quiet, precise registration of a person who has spent years documenting exactly this kind of thing. The word honey, the presumed direction, the complete absence of a question. She had turned left without correcting her. She had found 1A without assistance. She had put her bag in the overhead bin and sat down, and now 2 minutes later she could feel the approach before she heard it. Bet Larson moved with the particular authority of someone who had never been significantly wrong about anything in her own professional estimation. Her heels made a specific sound on the aircraft floor, controlled and deliberate. She stopped at the edge of 1A's pod, and the shadow of her presence fell across the open pages of Naomi's novel. Naomi did not look up immediately. She finished the sentence she was reading. Then she placed a bookmark carefully and looked up. Bet's expression was professionally arranged. It was the expression of someone performing patience and reasonable concern. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," she said. Her voice had the tone of a request, but the structure of an instruction. Naomi reached for her phone and opened the Pinnacle Air app with one thumb. She turned the screen toward Bet. The booking was displayed clearly. Naomi Reeves, Flight 112, Seat 1A, London Heathrow. The barcode at the bottom had been scanned at the gate 7 minutes ago, and the timestamp was visible. Bet looked at the screen. There was a fraction of a second where her eyes registered the information correctly. Naomi saw it, the brief flicker of a brain encountering data that contradicted its assumptions. And then the flicker passed, and Bet's expression reconfigured itself into something that looked like careful concern. "The app has been having issues," Bet said. She spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had prepared this explanation in advance, though she could not have known she would need it. "We've had complimentary upgrades processing incorrectly through the mobile system. Passengers sometimes arrive at the gate with what appears to be a first-class confirmation, but hasn't actually been cleared through the official seat allocation. I'm sure that's what's happened here. If you could just gather your belongings." "I am in my assigned seat," Naomi said. The words were simple and flat, not aggressive, not pleading, just the cleanest possible statement of fact. Betty tilted her head slightly. "Miss, My boarding pass states Seat 1A on Flight 112 to London. If there is a discrepancy, I'd suggest consulting the printed flight manifest. That would resolve any confusion quickly. Sophia Reyes had emerged from the galley during this exchange, holding a small trolley of pre-departure materials. She had stopped when she heard Naomi's voice. Now she stood at the edge of the galley curtain, close enough to see the phone screen from where she was positioned. She could read the seat number clearly from where she stood. She saw Bet's face. She saw the way Bet's jaw had set. Sophia Bet said without turning around, "Go and see to the beverages." Sophia hesitated for just a moment. Her mouth opened slightly, the beginning of a word that did not make it out. Then she looked at Naomi, and something passed between them, brief and wordless. Not a plea for help, more like an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what this is." Sophia took a step back toward the galley. But she did not go all the way in. She positioned herself just inside the curtain where she could still see the front of the cabin. "I'm going to need you to move to the main cabin," Bet said, turning back to Naomi. Her voice had moved past professional patience and into something that was not quite threatening, but was clearly its neighbor. "The register that said this is your last warning before things get unpleasant for you specifically." Naomi looked at her steadily. "Are you telling me that my digital boarding pass issued by your airline is fraudulent?" "I'm telling you there's been a mistake," Bet said. "And these things happen, and it's no reflection on you personally, but we are preparing for departure, and I need this seat available for its confirmed occupant." "I am the confirmed occupant," Naomi said. She opened her novel. The specific act of opening the novel at that moment of returning to the printed page, as if the conversation had concluded satisfactorily, was not a performance of indifference. It was something more precise. It was the behavior of a person who has been in this particular situation enough times to know that staying very, very still is the most powerful thing you can do when someone is trying to move you. Bet stared at her for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the galley, her footsteps slightly faster than they had been on the approach. From inside the galley, loud enough for only Sophia to hear, she said, "She did not come from that seat." "I know she did not come from that seat. Get me the gate agent on the internal line." Sophia looked at the manifest binder on the shelf beside her. It was right there. The printed passenger list. It would take her 11 seconds to pull it down, open it to the first class section, and run her finger down the column of names. 11 seconds and this would be over. She reached for it. "Don't touch that," Bet said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I will handle the verification myself. You are not authorized to make this call." Sophia's hand stopped 6 inches from the binder. She looked at the back of Bet's head as the older woman picked up the internal phone and began to dial. And Sophia stood in the galley and did not move and held the feeling of knowing exactly what she should do while being prevented from doing it, a feeling she recognized from too many places in her life, and she held it without letting it knock her over. In seat 1. Naomi turned a page. She was not reading. She had not read a word in the last 4 minutes. But the book was a tool, and she was using it correctly. Douglas Harmon entered the first-class cabin the way he entered most rooms, which is to say he entered it as though it had been assembled specifically for his arrival and was still in the process of meeting his standards. He paused at the cabin entrance, eyes sweeping the pod numbers with the practiced speed of a man who had done this hundreds of times, found his row, and began moving. He stopped in front of 1A. The pod door was open. Inside, a woman in a gray sweater was reading a book with the particular focused stillness of someone who was very deliberately not looking up. Douglas looked at the pod number, 1A. He looked at the woman. He looked at the pod number again. The shadow of him, the actual physical shadow cast by his height and the overhead lighting, fell across Naomi's book like a comment. She looked up. "Excuse me," Douglas said. The words were technically polite. The tone was a different instrument entirely. He was not asking to be excused. He was indicating that an obstacle needed to clear a path. Naomi looked at him. She waited. "You're in my seat," Douglas said. He pulled out his phone as he said it, opening his digital wallet with the aggressive precision of a man producing evidence at a deposition. "My assistant booked this 3 weeks ago. I am a Pinnacle Platinum Elite member. I fly this route twice a month." He held the phone's screen toward her for a moment, then pulled it back before she could actually read it. "There must be some kind of mistake, because I can assure you there is absolutely no way you are booked in 1A. The implication settled over the cabin like weather. He did not say the quiet part out loud. He did not need to. Some things do not require words, because the words would only make them more visible than their speakers want them to be. Naomi set her bookmark with precision. She looked at the seat number illuminated on the pod wall above her. She looked back at Douglas. "I understand your frustration, sir," she said. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been through difficult conversations in important rooms and knew that controlling your own register was the first and most significant move you could make. "My boarding pass clearly states 1A. The seat directly across from me is 1B. It's an aisle seat. Perhaps your assistant assigned you there." Douglas made a sound that was technically a laugh, but was not any kind of laugh that contained warmth. He looked around as though inviting a broader audience to appreciate the absurdity of what he was experiencing. "I don't take aisle seats," he said, "and I certainly don't take seating advice from someone who clearly bought a basic economy ticket and decided to play musical chairs before the crew noticed." The words landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height. In row 3, a woman named Priya Santos put down the travel magazine she had been reading. She was 31 years old and had been a journalist for 9 of those years, the last 4 of them writing about the travel industry for a publication with a significant online following. She had a journalist's instinct for the moment when something becomes a story and the moment had just arrived. She did not reach for her phone yet. She would give it another 60 seconds. She wanted to make sure she understood what she was seeing before she started recording it. In row 2, a man named Walter Finch lowered his newspaper slightly and looked toward the front of the cabin. He was 68 years old, retired from the federal judiciary after 35 years on the bench. He had a face that had been trained by decades of professional practice into a kind of deliberate neutrality, but the slight narrowing of his eyes suggested that his assessment of the situation was in process. In row 4, Claire Okafor glanced up from her laptop with the distracted expression of someone whose attention has been pulled against their will. She was 34 and worked in marketing strategy for a firm in London, and she had been trying to finish a presentation before the flight attendants made her close her computer. But something in the quality of the silence following Douglas's words made her close the laptop herself. Betta Larson reappeared at the galley curtain, as if summoned by a frequency only she could hear. She took in the scene, Douglas standing in the aisle with the aggressive posture of a man who had just said something awful and was waiting to be confirmed in it. Naomi sitting perfectly still with the quality of someone conserving energy for something important. "Mr. Harmon," Bette said, and her voice had undergone a transformation that was remarkable in its completeness. For Naomi, it had been careful and clipped. For Douglas, it became warm, concerned, and faintly conspiratorial. "I'm so sorry about this. We'll have it resolved immediately." She turned to Naomi. The warmth evaporated. "Miss, I'm going to ask you—" "You haven't looked at his boarding pass," Naomi said. Bette blinked. "I'm sorry. You asked me to show you mine the moment I sat down," Naomi said. "You have not asked Mr. Harmon to produce his once. In the time we've been having this conversation, he has shown it briefly and at a distance and pulled it back before anyone could read it. If there is genuinely a seating discrepancy, the correct procedure is to look at both boarding passes and compare them against the printed manifest. You know what the manifest will show." Bette's expression tightened in a way that was almost imperceptible, but not quite. I don't need to verify Mr. Harmon's credentials, she said. I know Mr. Harmon. You know what he looks like, Naomi said. That's not the same thing. The silence after that had a different quality than the previous silences. It was not the silence of people holding their breath. It was the silence of people processing the specific precision of what had just been said. Sophia, still standing at the galley doorway, looked down at the carpet. Douglas had gone slightly red. He was not a man who was accustomed to being on the wrong end of a logical argument, and he was not handling it with grace. He stepped closer to Naomi's pod, close enough that the action itself was a kind of statement. He placed his hand flat on the upper edge of the pod wall on the frame of the structure that contained Seat 1A. Not a touch, not a grip, just a placement, a physical notation of ownership. This seat belongs to me, he said, very quietly. The kind of quiet that is specifically not loudness. Naomi looked at his hand on the frame of her pod. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone cataloging a piece of evidence. Then she looked up at Bet, who had watched Douglas place his hand on Naomi's pod and had not said a word. That single silence from Bet told Naomi something she had already suspected, but now knew with the clean certainty of confirmed data. Remove your hand, Naomi said, looking at Douglas. Douglas removed his hand. He did it quickly and with irritation, as if the request had been unreasonable, as if he had simply been resting his arm and the fuss people made about it was exhausting. Bet began again. Miss, you are... Naomi looked at Bet directly. When this flight lands, she said, her voice dropping just slightly so that it became something that required people to be still and attentive to hear clearly. I will be reviewing every personnel file in your department. Every formal complaint ever filed about the service in this cabin. Every closure. Every name on every dismissal memo. You should know that now before we go any further. Bet let out a short, incredulous sound. Is that supposed to frighten me? She said. Who exactly do you think you are? It's not supposed to frighten you, Naomi said. It's supposed to be accurate. She opened her book. Douglas looked at Bet. Bet looked at Douglas. Neither of them quite knew what to do with the particular quality of certainty they had just encountered. In row 3, Priya Santos reached into her bag and took out her phone. She pressed record. Betty had a theory about passengers who gave her trouble. In 27 years, she had developed an internal framework for the different categories of difficult. There were the difficult passengers who were drunk. There were the ones who had been bumped from a previous flight and were operating on the accumulated frustration of an entire collapsed travel day. There were the ones who had a legitimate complaint and were making it badly with too much volume and not enough specificity. She had protocols for all of them. She had, through sheer repetition, become very good at handling each type. And then there was the type she was dealing with right now, the type that did not match the pattern, the type that was too still, too precise, too unhurried, the type that seemed to be operating with information that she did not have access to. Bette found this type the most dangerous. She straightened. Her jacket touched her 27 years pin, the way another person might touch a lucky charm, and returned to seat 1A with the expression of someone who has decided to escalate. Miss, she said. Her voice had moved past professional patience and into something that was not quite threatening, but was clearly its neighbor. You are interfering with crew duties and disrupting the boarding process of an international flight. This is your final warning. Gather your belongings and move to the main cabin immediately, or I will contact Port Authority and have officers escort you from this aircraft. She said it at a volume that the first 4 rows of the cabin could easily hear. This was a deliberate choice. Bet knew how public shame worked. She had used it before the raised voice, the formal language, the invocation of authority figures, not because she needed their help, but because the act of summoning them or threatening to change the social dynamic. It made the passenger the spectacle. It made the crew the victim. It made the surrounding passengers uncomfortable enough with the disruption that they unconsciously sided with whoever promised to end it fastest. She watched Naomi's face. Naomi's face did not change. Walter Finch, row 2, lowered his newspaper all the way. He had heard the volume of Bet's declaration. He had the retired judge's instinct for recognizing when a situation was being managed versus when it was being performed. He was not yet sure which of these this was. He was watching carefully. Douglas, having settled into 1B with the sullen energy of a man who has lost an argument he considered beneath him, brightened at Bet's declaration. He leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and targeted, aimed at Naomi across the narrow aisle. "You are embarrassing yourself. Take your bag and walk away before this gets ugly. People like you always try to game the system and it never works. Walk away now while you still can." In row 3, Priya Santos's phone was recording everything. Her thumb hovered over the live option. Not yet. She wanted to capture what came next first. Sophia emerged from the galley with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision and is not entirely comfortable with it, but is going through with it anyway. She stepped into the aisle and spoke in a voice that was quieter than Bet's, but considerably more direct. "Bet." She said the name clearly. "I can check the printed manifest right now. It's on the shelf in the galley. It will take 30 seconds and it will resolve this one way or another." Bet turned and looked at Sophia the way a person looks at something that has moved unexpectedly. "Quiet, Sophia. I am handling this." "It's in the protocol," Sophia said. "Seat discrepancy procedure requires checking the printed manifest before—" "Sophia." The single word was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the weight of the professional relationship between them, the weight of shift assignments and route preferences and performance evaluations, all of the infrastructure by which a senior crew member's displeasure could become a junior crew member's logistical inconvenience. Sophia stopped, but she did not go back into the galley. She stood in the doorway and held her position, which was less than she knew she should do, but more than she had done on previous flights when something similar had been unfolding. Naomi looked at Sophia for a moment. Not with gratitude exactly. With recognition. "I am not being hostile," Naomi said to Bet, returning her attention to the senior purser. "I am being precise. You have threatened me with arrest without examining any evidence. You have deferred to another passenger's verbal claim without asking him to produce documentation. And you have just prevented a colleague from following standard procedure. If you would like to resolve this in the way that the airline's own protocols require, the manifest is in that galley and this entire conversation ends in 30 seconds. Bet's eyes moved from Naomi to Sophia to Douglas and back again. She clasped her hands in front of her. Her voice was very controlled. "The manifest is an internal document," she said. "Passenger verification is conducted through the electronic system. I have conducted my verification, and I am satisfied with my conclusion. You are satisfied with the conclusion you reached before I sat down," Naomi said. "That's different from conducting a verification." Walter Finch had set his newspaper fully on his armrest. He was now watching Bet Larson with the focused attention he had once given to witnesses on the stand, who he suspected were not being entirely honest about their process of arriving at the testimony they were providing. He was not yet willing to say what he thought he was seeing. But he was watching very carefully. Claire Okafor had given up entirely on her presentation and was looking at the front of the cabin with an expression that had moved from distracted to uncomfortable to something that was beginning to resemble moral discomfort. "If you attempt to have me removed from this aircraft," Naomi said, her voice still level, "I will require that the reason be documented in writing, signed by you and the captain before I agree to stand up from this seat. That is my right as a ticketed passenger. You know it is." Bet looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and walked with great deliberateness toward the galley. "I am calling the captain," she said. She said it the way a person says a thing they have decided is a trump card. "You will regret this decision." She disappeared behind the curtain. Naomi turned a page. She was not reading, but she turned a page. Women like you always want to make this about something bigger than it is. That had been Bet's parting remark before she disappeared into the galley, delivered quietly but with the specific venom of something that had been held ready. Naomi did not react to it visibly, but she felt it travel down something deep in her chest and connect with a place that had been there for a very long time. She was 24 years old. She was in the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in Atlanta, and the carpet was the particular pattern of the mid-terminal that she had memorized because she had been standing on it for 22 minutes. She had a business-class ticket on a red-eye to LaGuardia. She was flying for a job interview that was the most important interview of her life so far. She was wearing the navy blazer her mother had bought her as a graduation gift and the black slacks she had pressed that morning in the bathroom of the apartment she shared with 2 other graduate students. She had a confirmed boarding pass. She had shown it to the woman at the podium. The woman at the podium had taken it, held it, looked at. Naomi looked at the boarding pass and said, "I'm going to need to verify this. Step aside, please." Naomi had stepped aside. Behind her, the next passenger in the business class priority lane, a white man in his 40s in a creased suit who had been talking on a phone the entire time and had barely glanced at the agent, was waved through in approximately 4 seconds. After him, a woman with a designer carry-on and a harried expression, waved through. After her, a man with no visible luggage and the appearance of someone who had not slept, waved through without any verification at all. Naomi stood beside the podium for 22 minutes. The agent checked a screen, checked it again, called someone on a phone, spoke quietly, hung up, made a note, called another number. The gate closed. Naomi was told without anyone meeting her eyes that there had been a system error and her seat had been allocated to another passenger. They would be happy to accommodate her in economy. She sat by the emergency exit for 6 hours. She did not sleep. She pressed her forehead to the cold of the oval window and watched Atlanta shrink into a grid of lights below her and then disappear into cloud. And she thought about the word verify, about the specific quality of the request, and about the passengers who had walked through behind her. She did not cry on the plane. She was holding something that was too large for crying. It was the sensation of being made suddenly aware of the weight of something that had always been there, but that you had been up to this exact moment successfully distributing across your whole body without noticing it. She opened the notebook she always carried and wrote very carefully the date, the location, the name of the airline, and the description of what had happened. She wrote it the way a scientist records an observation neutrally, completely without editorializing. Then she wrote at the bottom, "Remember this, not to be angry, to be better." At her interview the next morning, she had dark circles and the particular alertness of someone running on adrenaline and principle. The interviewer, a white man in his 50s who had been in aviation for 3 decades, had asked her the standard opening question, "Why do you want to work in this industry?" Naomi had looked at him across his desk and said, "Because I flew business class last night and ended up in a middle seat in economy. And the reason wasn't a system error. I want to fix that." He had not offered her the job. He thought she was too direct, too focused on what he called peripheral concerns, rather than the core business metrics. 3 years later, that same company had invited her back at 4 times the salary she had originally been offered. By then, she had already taken a better position somewhere else. She had kept the notebook. It was the first in a series that now filled a small shelf in her home office. In seat 1. 18 years later, Naomi let that memory settle back into its place. She looked at the galley curtain behind which Bet Larson was doing something she could not see. "I was 24 years old the first time this happened to me," she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, but the words carried in the stillness of the cabin. I have been waiting 18 years for someone to check the manifest. The words were not loud, but in the specific quiet that had fallen over the first few rows of the cabin, they carried the way truth sometimes carries, not because it is shouted, but because everything else is slightly less real by comparison. From inside the galley, Naomi could hear Bet's voice on the internal phone, low and urgent. She could not make out the words, but she could hear the shape of them, the way you can hear the structure of an argument through a closed door without catching the specific points. Sophia had moved further into the galley. She could hear everything. Bet was speaking to the gate agent desk. Sophia recognized the extension from the sequence of buttons pressed. She stood near the galley entrance and listened, and what she heard made her press her lips together very carefully. Bet was describing the situation, but the description was structured in a particular way, shaped around a conclusion rather than toward one. She was asking the gate agent to confirm something, rather than asking them to check something. There was a difference between those two requests, and the difference was significant. Sophia heard the gate agent's voice, younger, hesitant. She heard him begin to say something, and she heard Bet speak over him before he could finish. Thank you. That's all I needed. Bet put the phone down and turned around. Sophia did not move out of the way in time. They looked at each other. Gate confirms the discrepancy, Bet said. Her voice had recovered its authority. Your app ticket is invalid. She looked at Sophia with an expression that carried a clear instruction in it, not this time. Sophia said nothing, but her jaw tightened. Bet walked back into the cabin. Gate confirms the discrepancy, Bet said to Naomi. Your mobile ticket has not been cleared through the official seat allocation process. I need you to collect your bag and move to the main cabin. Naomi looked at her for a moment. Then she said, May I speak with the gate agent directly? That won't be necessary. I'd like to hear the confirmation myself. That is not how this process works, Bet said. Naomi set her book down with a precision that suggested she was done using it as a prop. I want to be very precise about what just happened, she said. You called the gate desk. You told them what conclusion you were looking for before they had finished checking. You spoke over them before they could give you a complete answer. And you are now presenting that as an official confirmation. That is not a verification. That is a fabrication. The word landed in the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Bet's face went through several rapid changes. You are accusing me, she said, her voice rising for the first time in the entire exchange. You are actually standing there and accusing me of lying. I am describing what I heard Naomi said. From where I'm sitting. From row 2, Walter Finch had fully abandoned the pretense of reading. He was looking at the front of the cabin with a focused attention that was no longer casual. He had spent 35 years evaluating testimony. He had an extremely well-calibrated instrument for detecting the difference between someone who was responding to a situation and someone who was managing a narrative. He was beginning to form a view. Douglas from 1B had been listening. He leaned forward now with the expression of a man who has been handed a gift. She's calling crew members liars now, he said loudly. Bete, have her removed. This is completely unacceptable. I have a board meeting in London, and this flight was supposed to have left 6 minutes ago. In row 3, Priya Santos made a quiet decision. She opened her phone, selected the live streaming option, typed a caption, and pressed go. For anyone watching, Priya said her voice at a conversational level, just clear enough to carry this woman, has presented a valid digital boarding pass issued by Pinnacle Air. The printed flight manifest has not been checked at any point in the last 25 minutes. The gentleman in the seat directly across from her has not been asked to produce his boarding pass once. A few heads turned in the cabin. Not all of them, but enough. The live viewer count was climbing. 200 people. 400. 700. Someone's filming, Douglas said sharply. Priya's voice did not waver. I'm a journalist, she said pleasantly. And this is a public space before Wheels Up. I know the regulations. Bet's eyes moved to the phone in Priya's hand, then to Claire Okafor, who had also lifted her phone, then to a man 3 rows back who had his pointed toward the front. The landscape of her situation had changed. Sophia, she said, emerging from the galley. Sophia had been standing in the doorway for the last 2 minutes. The manifest. Get me the manifest binder. She said it as though it had been her idea all along. Sophia's expression did not change. She turned back to the galley shelf, lifted the blue binder, and carried it out. Bet took it from her without looking at her. She opened it to the first class section. She ran her finger down the column of names. Her finger stopped. She was very still for a moment. In seat 1. Naomi watched Bet's face with the unhurried attention of someone who has already read the last page. Bet closed the binder. There may be a discrepancy in how the booking was entered into the system, she said. Her voice had gone flat in a way that was worse in some respects than her earlier aggression. I will need to consult with the captain. You just read it, Sophia said quietly from behind her. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You read the name, didn't you? Sophia. Betty said one word that was meant to close a door. Sophia looked at Naomi. I'm sorry, she said. It came out as 2 plain words, but they carried the weight of everything she had not done and everything she had. Naomi looked at her. It's all right, she said. You're doing the right thing now. Betty put the binder under her arm like a shield and walked back toward the galley with the stiff, deliberate steps of someone performing composure. On Priya's live stream, the viewer count passed 3,000. You are the only disruption here. Everything was fine before you decided you belonged somewhere you clearly don't. Betty had said it on her way back toward the galley. Not quietly enough. Naomi heard it. She heard the words, and she felt them travel the familiar route they always traveled down through something that was not quite composure and not quite resignation, but was the specific quality that develops in people who have been told versions of the same thing enough times that they have learned to feel it without being undone by it. She looked out the window at the wet tarmac. She was in Dubai. She was 31. The conference had gone well better than expected, and she had been invited to join a panel that would eventually lead to 3 significant consulting contracts in the region. She was flying home via London business class because the conference organizers had arranged it and she had not argued. She had her conference lanyard still around her neck when she got to the premium lounge in Terminal 3. She had been in Dubai International enough times to know where it was without checking the signs. She walked to the entrance and held up her lounge pass. The security attendant looked at her pass, looked at her, back at the pass. I'll need to call my supervisor, he said. She stood to the side. In the 90 seconds that followed, 4 other people entered the lounge. She counted them. She had started counting these moments 3 years earlier when she had first understood that what she was experiencing was not a series of individual incidents but a pattern. Counting was the way she converted what could have been rage or despair into something she could use. All 4 people were waved through with no verification. 3 of the 4 were white. 1 was East Asian. None of them were made to stand to the side. The supervisor arrived, looked at the pass, looked at Naomi and said with a careful smile, I do apologize for the wait. Please come through. No explanation for the wait. No acknowledgement of what had produced it. Naomi went to a table near the window and opened her notebook. She wrote the date, the location, the airline's lounge, and a description of what had happened. She wrote it in the same precise, neutral way she had always written these things, and then she wrote a number at the bottom of the entry. 7. It was the 7th time that year. It was October. She had been keeping the count since she was 26, when she had tried to enter a hotel fitness center on a work trip in Frankfurt and been asked alone among all the people she could see using the machines through the glass door to provide her room number and photo ID. She had given them. She had been let in. She had done the workout. She had written it down. The notebook she was writing in Dubai was her fourth. By the time she was appointed COO of Pinnacle Air, she had 11 notebooks. They sat on a shelf in her home office, their spines facing outward, arranged chronologically. She had never shown them to anyone. They were not intended to be shown to anyone. They were intended to be understood. The notebooks were the reason she was qualified for the job she had been given. Not in the sense that they proved anything to a hiring committee, but in the sense that they had given her an understanding of the thing she was being hired to fix that no consultant hired from outside could have possessed. She did not just know what the problem looked like in data. She knew what it felt like from the inside of it. She knew, for example, the specific weight of being told that everything was fine before you arrived. The implication of that sentence. The assumption embedded in it that your presence was the disruption that the world had been running correctly until you showed up and made it complicated by refusing to disappear. In seat 1. She looked at the galley curtain and thought about the 11 notebooks. She thought about the woman in the manifest binder who had clearly just read her name, and the name had clearly registered something that the name of a regular passenger should not have registered, and Bet had closed the binder anyway. She thought about Sophia standing in the galley doorway. I carry it. Naomi thought not as complaint, not as wound. I carry it as evidence. And evidence held long enough and documented carefully enough eventually becomes something no one can look at a binder and pretend they didn't see. She turned back to the cabin. She was ready for whatever came next. The cabin of Flight 112 had the quality now of a room in which everyone is aware that something important is happening and no one quite knows where it is going to go. Conversations that had been starting and stopping for the last several rows had gone quiet. The particular performance of not watching, of being deeply engrossed in phones or novels or the middle distance, had largely been abandoned. People were watching. From 5 rows back, a man in a blue shirt leaned toward his seatmate and said in a voice that was audible to several rows, "Can we just get this bird in the air? Some of us have connections in London." Douglas seized this. He had been waiting for reinforcement. "Exactly," he said loudly. "This is completely unacceptable. Bet, I want this resolved in the next 60 seconds or I am filing a formal complaint about your crew's inability to manage a basic boarding situation." He was being pushed from both directions, from the passenger behind him who was annoyed at the delay, and from the woman in 1A who had refused to be moved, and the combination of those two pressures was pushing him toward something that he probably would have described later if asked as decisive action. Bet emerged from the galley. She had the manifest binder under her arm and an expression that had resolved itself into something fixed and hard. She walked to seat 1. Reached up to the overhead bin, closed her fingers around the handle of Naomi's leather tote and said, "I'm removing your bag. You can collect it at the gate." The cabin went completely silent. Naomi stood up. It was the first time in the entire exchange that she had stood. She had been sitting so consistently, so deliberately, that the act of rising carried its own weight. She was not tall, but she stood with the quality of a person who takes up exactly as much space as they mean to take up, which is its own kind of presence. Betty and Naomi were eye level. "Take your hand off my bag," Naomi said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. In the silence of the cabin, it was the only sound in the world. Bet's hand remained on the handle of the tote. 1 second, 2 seconds. Long enough for Priya Santos's phone to capture it clearly from row 3. Long enough for Claire Okafor's phone, and the phone of the off-duty flight attendant in row 7 who had also started recording 20 minutes ago to document the moment precisely. A voice came from row 2. Excuse me. Walter Finch had stood up. He was 68 years old, and he had the physical presence of a man who had spent decades in rooms where his posture mattered. He was not especially tall, but he was composed in a way that suggested he had never once in his adult life felt the need to assert himself by volume. He looked at Bet with the expression of someone who has arrived at a conclusion after careful consideration. "I have been observing this exchange for the last 25 minutes, he said. His voice had the measured cadence of someone accustomed to speaking for the record. "This passenger has presented documentation. You have refused on multiple occasions to consult the printed manifest which is directly available to you, and you just reached for her personal property without any authorization to do so." He paused. "I spent 35 years on the federal bench. I know the difference between enforcing a procedure and targeting a person. This is the second thing. The specific weight of those words, the identification, the precision of the distinction settled over the cabin in a way that was different from everything that had come before." Bet's hand came off the tote handle. She did not remove it gracefully. She removed it with the slightly jerky motion of a person reacting to something they had not anticipated. She turned to Walter. "Sir, this is a crew matter. I need you to stay in your seat." Walter did not sit down. "I am in my seat," he said. "The aisle is between us. I am simply speaking." He looked across at Douglas. "You, sir," Walter said. "Produce your boarding pass. Right now, please." Douglas blinked. He was not accustomed to being addressed this way by strangers. "What?" "Your boarding pass," Walter said. "This woman has been asked to show hers since the moment she sat down. You have not been asked once. I am asking now. Let's see it." Douglas looked at Bet. Bet looked at Douglas. Something passed between them that was not a conversation but was the acknowledgement of a shared problem. Douglas reached into his jacket and brought out his phone. He opened his digital wallet. He looked at the screen. Something in his face changed. He looked at it for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he lowered the phone slightly, not so that others could see it more clearly, but so that he could look past it. Naomi was watching him with the expression of someone who already knows how this ends. "Read it out loud," Walter said pleasantly. Douglas did not read it out loud. He said nothing. He looked at the seat number above 1A, then at the seat number above 1B, and then he sat down in 1B with the compressed energy of a man absorbing a significant blow in a public place and trying to appear as though he has not felt it. Priya Santos had been a journalist long enough to know that there was a difference between recording a story and being inside one, and that the second was considerably more complicated than the first. She had covered government press conferences and airline industry summits, and the kind of deeply procedural story that required sitting through 8 hours of testimony to extract 40 usable seconds of material. She had not expected this Tuesday night flight to London to be the most significant piece of journalism she would produce in 4 years. She pressed the live button. For anyone joining, she said, her voice conversational, her phone steady. "I'm on board Pinnacle Air, Flight 112 at JFK Gate B24. What you're seeing is a first-class passenger who has been sitting in her assigned seat 1A for approximately 30 minutes. She has presented a valid digital boarding pass. The printed manifest was finally retrieved, and the crew member who read it chose not to share what it contained. The passenger has not raised her voice once. She has not been hostile. She has not moved." She paused as the cabin processed what had just happened with Walter Finch and Douglas. Priya continued. "The passenger in 1B just declined to read his boarding pass aloud when asked by a fellow traveler. The boarding pass that passenger in 1B has been claiming would confirm his right to seat 1A. The live viewer count moved steadily. 800, 1,200, 2,000. Comments were coming in faster than she could read. People were watching from phones and laptops and the small screens of other aircraft on other routes. They were watching from living rooms and break rooms and late-night offices. The specifics of what was happening in a first-class cabin in a plane that had not yet left the gate at JFK were circulating outward in the particular way that things circulate when they are real and unedited, and when the person in the middle of it is standing perfectly, utterly, immovably still. Priya Naomi said from seat 1A. Priya looked up. Naomi was not asking her to stop. She was acknowledging her. There was a difference. Priya gave her a small nod. Claire Okafor in row 4 had opened her phone as well. She was not live streaming. She was recording a still backup, the kind of thing you make when you want a record that exists independent of any single platform's decisions about content moderation. She was 34 years old, and she had worked in communications long enough to understand exactly what kind of moment this was. Bet, standing at the edge of the galley, had seen the phones. She had seen the live indicator on Priya's screen from 8 feet away. She had heard the viewer numbers mentioned in someone's whispered comment. She calculated. All electronic devices, she said, raising her voice slightly, must be placed in airplane mode for departure. Filming crew members without explicit consent may constitute. The FAA regulation on filming applies during flight, Walter Finch said from row 2 without standing up. He had sat back down after his intervention. We are still at the gate. You know that. Bet's mouth closed. She looked at the cabin, at the phones, at the woman reading a novel in seat 1A who had not moved and had not raised her voice, and had not done a single thing that could be characterized by any honest observer as disruptive. At Douglas in 1B staring at his seatback screen with the expression of a man who has walked into a room and cannot find the door. 27 years, Bet thought. 27 years and no one had ever... She reached for the interphone handset on the galley wall. She was calling the captain. Priya's viewer count hit 11,000. Captain James Ward was 58 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 31 of them. Before that, he had flown for the Navy, which had given him, among other things, a very high tolerance for difficulty and a very low tolerance for things that did not need to be complicated, becoming complicated. He was in the middle of a pre-departure checklist with his first officer when the interphone buzzed. Ward, he said. Captain, it's Bet, his senior purser on this route 5 years running. He knew the voice well. It was tighter than usual. I have a serious situation in the forward cabin. Unruly passenger in seat 1A. She has a fraudulent digital boarding pass and is refusing to comply with crew instructions. I need authorization for removal. Captain Ward looked at his first officer, who had the controlled expression of someone staying out of a conversation that was not his yet. Bet Ward said, Did you check the printed manifest? A pause. The gate was very rushed, sir. There may be a glitch in the... Did you check the printed manifest? Not yet, but... What is the passenger's name? He heard Bet move or sensed it through some quality of the silence that followed. A slight hesitation of a body in transit. She says Naomi Reeves, Bet said. But Captain, I genuinely believe... Stay where you are, Captain Ward said. I'm coming out. He hung up the interphone. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on his knees. 4 days ago, he had attended a senior leadership briefing at Pinnacle Air's corporate offices in Manhattan. It had been a mandatory attendance meeting, the kind that required a note in your file if you missed it without cause. The primary agenda item had been the introduction of the new Chief Operations Officer, a position that had been vacant for 8 months, and that the board had finally filled by recruiting someone from outside the airline. The briefing had included a detailed presentation. There had been a photograph on the projector screen. The photograph had been on the screen for approximately 2 hours, including during the extended question and answer session about the new executive's mandate and methodologies. The photograph had shown a 42-year-old woman with natural hair pulled back from her face and eyes that recorded everything. The name on the screen below the photograph had read, Dr. Naomi Reeves, Chief Operations Officer, Pinnacle Air. Captain Ward stood up from his seat. He was a person who in 31 years of aviation had prided himself on the specific quality of being unshakable. He had landed aircraft with one engine and declared emergencies with the voice of someone discussing the weather, and held a cabin together through turbulence severe enough to send laptops to the ceiling. He had not in 31 years ever felt the particular cold wash of the feeling he was currently experiencing. He opened the flight deck door. In the cabin, the effect of the door opening was immediate. The quality of attention that had been building for 30 minutes reached a new level. Conversation stopped. Phones that had drifted downward came back up. Sophia in the galley doorway straightened slightly. Douglas in 1B turned his head. Bet was moving to intercept the captain before he could see too much for himself. "Captain Ward," she began, "I am so incredibly sorry to pull you out during the checklist, but we have a passenger who is absolutely refusing to comply, and Mr. Harmon here is a Platinum Elite member who—" Captain Ward put his hand up, not in a way that was aggressive. In the way that a person who is authoritative and controlled uses a hand to indicate that words should wait while they assess the situation directly. He looked at Douglas Harmon briefly. He looked at Bet. He looked at Sophia, who was standing very still in the galley doorway. Then his eyes moved to seat 1A. In the galley, Sophia realized she was holding her breath. In row 3, Priya Santos's viewer count hit 28,000. In row 2, Walter Finch watched the captain's face. Captain Ward walked past Bet. He walked past Douglas. He stopped at seat 1A. The woman in seat 1A looked up from her novel. For 3 seconds, the entire forward section of Flight 112 was as silent as any space containing more than 30 people can be. It was the silence of a room holding its breath. It was the silence that precedes a shift of some kind, the way the air goes still in the particular moment before weather changes. Captain James Ward looked at the face in seat 1A. The color change in his face was visible from row 4. It was not a dramatic change. It was the specific change that happens to a person when they encounter information that rearranges everything they thought they understood about the last several minutes. The kind of change that is not shock exactly, but is the recognition of significance, the bodily understanding that something that is happening is much larger than it appeared to be from a distance. Bet stepped up behind him. She had been reading his reaction as vindication. Yes, exactly. She was primed to say the sheer entitlement, Captain. She had been working this cabin for 27 years, and she had never encountered anyone who wouldn't eventually fold under the right kind of pressure. And here was the captain. Here was the authority she had summoned, and he was visibly affected by what he was seeing. She had misread the effect. Captain Ward said nothing for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was quiet and clear and that carried in the stillness of the cabin the way a bell carries Dr. Reeves. "Good evening, ma'am. It is an honor to have you on board tonight. I apologize that I wasn't informed you would be joining our manifest." The silence that followed was not the silence of people holding their breath. It was the silence of people trying to process the specific and complete reversal of everything they had understood to be happening. Bet's hand, which had been raised slightly as she prepared to speak, dropped to her side. She looked at the captain's back. She looked at the woman in seat 1A. She looked at the captain's back again. Her brain was running the words over and generating outputs that did not make sense to her. Dr. Reeves, honor. I wasn't informed. Dr. Reeves, honor. Wasn't informed. From row 3, Priya Santos's phone captured the captain's posture, the precise angle of his back, the way his head was inclined toward the woman in 1A with the deference of someone addressing a significant authority. Viewer count 43,000. The number was climbing in increments that looked less like individual people joining and more like someone had turned on a tap. Douglas Harmon had looked up from his seatback screen. He was listening. Something in the quality of the captain's voice had penetrated the particular shell of self-absorption that Douglas had been living inside for the last 40 minutes. The COO, he said. The words came out as a half-sentence unfinished because the second half required him to complete an implication he was not yet ready to fully experience. Naomi placed her bookmark in her novel for what she intended to be the final time that evening. She looked at Captain Ward. She looked around the cabin at bed at Douglas, at the phones and the faces and the particular quality of the attention directed at her. She spoke clearly. "Captain Ward," she said. "My name is Dr. Naomi Reeves. I was appointed Chief Operations Officer of Pinnacle Airlines 3 weeks ago. Tonight is the final flight of an incognito review of this airline's routes. I booked this seat through the executive corporate office at full fare, and I specifically requested that no executive designation be attached to my passenger profile." She paused. "I wanted to see what this airline looked like when it thought nobody important was watching." The gasp that went through the cabin was not dramatic. It was the soft, collective exhalation of people who have been given a piece of information that reframes the last 30 minutes of their lives. From the back of the first-class section, a woman's voice said quietly, "She's the COO in row 4. Claire Okafor had stopped recording and was looking at the front of the cabin with an expression that had moved past surprise into something that looked like the specific personal feeling of having been present for something you will tell people about for the rest of your life. Walter Finch in row 2 exhaled slowly. He had not known. He had acted without knowing. That was not, he thought, irrelevant. Captain Ward turned to look at Bet. The look he gave her was not angry in any theatrical way. It was the specific expression of a person who has spent their life in a profession that requires them to mean what they say, looking at someone who has just, in 30 minutes, done nearly everything incorrectly. "Did you check the printed manifest, Betty?" he said. She looked at him. "I checked it," she said. "What did it say?" "Silence." Captain Ward looked at the binder under her arm. Douglas Harmon had gone very quiet in 1B. He was looking at his boarding pass, which was still open on his phone. The number on the screen was 1B. It had always been 1B. His assistant had booked him into 1B. He had walked on to this aircraft and looked at 1A and concluded without checking, without asking, without pausing for the single second that would have been required to look at the pass in his own hand, that the woman sitting there could not possibly have a right to that space. He had spent 20 minutes being completely, categorically, publicly wrong. He stared at the seat number on his phone. He had just watched the woman he had spent 20 minutes trying to remove from her seat reveal herself as the Chief Operations Officer of the airline, whose first-class cabin they were both sitting in, and somewhere in the part of his brain that was good at calculations, a very uncomfortable number was assembling itself. $65 million over 4 years. The proposal his firm had submitted to Pinnacle Air last Thursday. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Naomi stood up from seat 1A for the second time that evening. This time was different. The first time she had risen, it had been a response to Bet reaching for her bag, a natural physical correction to someone overstepping a boundary. This time she stood with the quality of someone who has finished being a passenger and is now something else. The change was subtle. It did not require a change of clothes or a raised voice or any kind of announcement. It was entirely a function of posture and intention. "Captain Ward," she said, "I am stepping out of my role as a passenger and assuming my executive authority effective immediately. Please allow me to address the situation in the forward cabin." Captain Ward nodded. "Yes, Dr. Reeves," he said. The phrasing, the yes, before the name, the particular quality of the acknowledgement was noted by every person in the first 4 rows. Naomi looked at Bet. "In 30 minutes, she said you have done the following. You refused to consult the printed manifest, despite being asked to do so twice, by me and by a junior colleague. You misrepresented the result of a phone call with the gate agent to produce a conclusion that supported a decision you had already made. You publicly threatened a ticketed passenger with arrest based on no evidence. You attempted to remove that passenger's personal property from an overhead bin without authorization. And you suppressed a junior colleague who was attempting to follow standard procedure by threatening consequences to her shift assignments. She paused. Bet's face had gone to a color that was not quite gray, but was moving in that direction. Her hand had found her 27 years pin and was pressing it against her lapel. Naomi continued, "I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. When you decided I did not belong in this seat, what information were you working from?" Bet opened her mouth. "I thought..." "What did you think?" Bet's voice, when it came, was very small. "I thought she didn't belong here." The shift from third person to first person was not lost on the cabin. Bet had been speaking about Naomi in the third person for 27 minutes. Now, finally, she had said she. "I know," Naomi said. "That is the problem." She let a single moment pass. "Senior Purser Larson," she said. "You are suspended from duty, effective immediately pending a full human resources investigation and a formal termination hearing. You will not be working this flight. Captain Ward, please arrange for Miss Larson to be escorted off the aircraft." Betty let out a sound that was not quite a word. "Captain," she said, turning to Ward. 25 years. My pension. You can't." "It is no longer my decision," Captain Ward said. His voice was not unkind, but it was final. "Dr. Reeves has issued a direct executive order. Furthermore, as pilot in command, I am classifying your conduct this evening as a disruption to the safety and operational standards of this flight. Gather your belongings." He reached for the interphone and called the gate desk. "This is Captain Ward on Flight 112. I need a Port Authority escort at the aircraft door for a suspended crew member." "Thank you." Bet stood in the aisle for a moment, and it was possible to watch something happening to her that was slow and total the way a building looks when a structural element has been removed. 27 years of professional identity, the seniority, the authority, the pin on her lapel, the knowledge of every passenger's name and preference, and the particular conviction that her judgment was the last word in this cabin, all of it rearranging itself into something that did not provide the foundation she had believed it did. "Those 27 years are exactly why this is serious," Naomi said, and her voice had lost its executive crispness and become something quieter. "You had 27 years to know better." Naomi turned to face Douglas. He had been very still in 1B, the posture of a man trying not to draw attention, which was new for him. "Mr. Harmon," Naomi said, "read your boarding pass aloud, please." "A beat," 1B Douglas said. "Aisle seat." "An aisle seat," Naomi said. "Exactly as I told you 30 minutes ago." She looked at him steadily. "In the last 30 minutes, she said, you have verbally characterized me as someone gaming the system. You have made classist implications that were heard by everyone in this cabin. You referenced people like you in a way that required no further explanation for context. You placed your hand on the frame of my pod in a way that was intended to be physically intimidating. And you leveraged your platinum status to pressure my crew into acting against a ticketed passenger." Douglas said nothing. "Would you like to tell me the name of your firm, Harmon Capital Group?" he said. The words came out much smaller than any words Douglas Harmon had produced in the last hour. "Harmon Capital Group submitted a proposal to Pinnacle Airlines last Thursday," Naomi said. "Infrastructure and maintenance partnerships for European hub operations, $65 million over 4 years if I have the figure correct." Douglas looked up. "That proposal will be formally rejected," Naomi said. "Tomorrow morning. We do not enter into partnerships with organizations whose leadership cannot extend basic respect to a fellow human being. If you treat a woman sitting quietly in her assigned seat like a problem to be removed, I can only imagine how you treat the ground crew and maintenance teams your firm would be managing." Douglas let out a short, shaky breath. "You can't," he said. 65 million. I'm ending a consideration of a partnership, Naomi said, because of what you revealed about your judgment and character. The seat was just where you chose to reveal it. The cabin was very quiet. Walter Finch cleared his throat. He stood. "If I may," he said. His voice carried the weight of someone who is making a public statement and means it. Naomi looked at him. "Please." "I want to be transparent," Walter said. "When this situation began, I made an assumption. I looked at the crew member and the passenger, and my first instinct was to side with the crew. I adjusted my view when I examined the evidence more carefully, but my first instinct was wrong." He paused. "I spent 35 years requiring other people to examine their assumptions before reaching conclusions. Tonight, I did not meet my own standard. I am sorry for that." He looked directly at Naomi. "And I am grateful you stayed in your seat." Naomi looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for speaking," she said. When it mattered, it was Claire Okafor in row 4 who started the applause. It was not the applause of a performance. It was not celebratory or theatrical. It was the deliberate, considered applause of people who have watched something happen and want to record in the way that only sound and presence can record it, that they were there and that they understood what they had seen. It spread through the cabin slowly. On Priya Santos's live stream, the viewer count passed 60,000. Bet Larson was in the forward section of the jet bridge, her crew bag at her feet, waiting for the Port Authority escort that Captain Ward had called. The sounds of the cabin came to her muffled through the aircraft wall. She could hear, though not distinctly, the quality of the applause. She stood with her hand against the textured plastic wall of the jet bridge and did not move. Inside, Sophia Reyes had moved to stand near the galley curtain, not quite in the aisle, but visible from seat 1A. She was holding the edge of the curtain with one hand, not gripping it, just touching it lightly the way a person touches a wall for balance when they are not sure the floor is completely stable. "Dr. Reeves," she said. Naomi looked at her. "There's something you need to know," Sophia said. Her voice was at a level that was not quite private, but it was clearly addressed to Naomi rather than to the cabin. "I need to tell you about tonight, and about the pattern." Naomi's expression did not change. "Tell me," she said. Sophia took a breath. "In the last 16 months, she said carefully, I personally saw Betty redirect at least 11 passengers away from the first-class cabin. All of them were traveling alone. All of them were dressed casually. All of them were people of color." A brief silence. "She said it was cabin management," Sophia continued. "That their bookings hadn't processed correctly or that there had been an upgrade error. 3 of them had valid first-class tickets. I know they did because 2 of them showed me their boarding passes before they left. They just left. They didn't argue. They went back to economy." Naomi was very still. "Did you file a complaint?" she asked. "I filed 2, Sophia said. She did not look away. Both were closed within the same week. The note said resolved no evidence of misconduct. Naomi said, "Who closed them?" "The senior cabin manager for this route," Sophia said. "And the regional crew director. They've known Bet for 15 years. They've worked together since before I was certified." The cabin around them had gone quiet again, not with the tension of conflict, but with the particular stillness of people listening to something important and understanding that it is important. Naomi reached into her tote and took out her phone. She dialed from memory. "Diane," she said when the call connected. She spoke crisply. "Pull the complaint logs for the first-class cabin team on the Heathrow route. 24 months. Every closure that was marked resolved. I need who filed them, who closed them, and the full timeline. Tonight." Diane's voice came back clear and efficient. "You'll have it before we reach cruising altitude." Naomi ended the call. She looked at Sophia. "You filed those complaints knowing what it might mean for your assignments," she said. Sophia looked at the floor briefly. I filed them, and nothing happened. I thought maybe I'd done it wrong. You did it exactly right, Naomi said. The failure was not yours. A pause. Sophia looked up. I should have done more, she said. Months ago. On those other flights, I should have. What you did tonight took courage, Naomi said. Both times. When you tried to check the manifest under direct pressure and right now. Those are not small things. She looked at the galley doorway. Sophia, tonight you are acting senior purser for the duration of this flight. I will notify the airline's HR and crew management departments when we land. We will discuss making that position permanent. Sophia opened her mouth, then closed it, then said quietly, Thank you. Naomi found Captain Ward near the cockpit door. She spoke to him in the low, direct register of one professional to another. When we land, she said, I'll need full access to crew conduct records for this entire route. Not just Bet's file, her supervisors, the complaint closures, the people who signed off on the resolved determinations. Captain Ward nodded slowly. You think this goes deeper than her? It always does, Naomi said. Bet Larson did not develop this behavior in a vacuum. She did it because no one stopped her. That means someone either did not see it or chose not to. In my experience, it is almost always the second thing. Captain Ward looked down at the floor for a moment. I've heard things he said. Over the years, comments, incidents that got smoothed over. Then you'll help me find them. It was not a question. Captain Ward heard it as the thing it was an opportunity to do belatedly, the right thing. Yes, Dr. Reeves, he said. I will. Naomi looked back at the cabin, at the passengers settling into their seats as the final boarding concluded. At Sophia moving through the first-class section with a new quality in her bearing, something straighter and more considered. At Douglas Harmon sitting in 1B with the stillness of a man who is running numbers in his head and not liking any of them. This was never about a seat, Naomi thought. It had never been about a seat. It had been about the 11 passengers who had been quietly turned away in 16 months, and the 2 complaints that had been closed before anyone with authority looked at them, and the 15-year professional relationship that had provided cover for the pattern to continue. It had been about every person who had sat in the economy section of a flight they had paid for in first class, and had been too tired or too uncertain or too accustomed to the weight of the thing to argue about it. She picked up her novel. This time she actually read it. Bet Larson walked the length of the jet bridge at JFK's Terminal 4 with her crew bag rolling behind her, and the sound it made on the ridged floor was the only sound she made. The Port Authority officers flanked her at a respectful distance, which she did not find respectful. She passed the gate podium, where the young gate agent watched her go with the particular expression of someone who has been a small part of something they do not fully understand. She passed the entrance to the main terminal. The 27 years pin was still on her lapel. She had not taken it off. She did not look at it. The HR office at JFK was on the ground floor of the terminal's administrative wing, a room with fluorescent lighting and the particular smell of institutional air conditioning that has been circulating since the 1990s. Her union representative was already there when she arrived. He had seen the live stream. He had read the viewer count, which by this point had passed 80,000. He had reviewed the complaint logs that had been forwarded to him by the airline's legal team in the hour since the captain had made his call. He pushed a box of tissues across the table toward her and told her in the careful, measured way of someone delivering bad news to a person who already knows what it is that there was nothing he could do. Bet was terminated for gross misconduct, discriminatory behavior toward a passenger, misrepresentation to crew management, and suppression of a junior colleague's attempt to follow established procedure. The grounds were documented and witnessed and time-stamped and had been captured on 4 separate recording devices by passengers who had submitted their footage voluntarily. She forfeited her flight benefits immediately. The pension after review would be significantly impacted. The airline's HR department noted that investigation had also revealed she was one of 2 supervisors whose names appeared on the closure records of both complaints Sophia Reyes had filed. A broader review of the 11 redirected passengers was being initiated. She sat in that room for a long time after the meeting ended and looked at the wall and thought about the 47 seconds it would have taken to pull the manifest binder off the shelf in the galley. Douglas Harmon landed at Heathrow at 7:42 the following morning. He did not sleep on the flight. He turned his phone back on as the wheels touched down and held it in both hands in the way of a man who knows what is in an envelope but must open it anyway. The message from his board chair was brief and not warm. The formal rejection of Harmon Capital Group's proposal arrived from Pinnacle Air's executive office at 9:03 the same morning as Naomi had said it would. By 10, the video had been picked up by 3 major financial news outlets. By noon, Douglas's board had convened an emergency call. He resigned before they could vote. 3 months later, Pinnacle Air's customer satisfaction scores reached their highest level in 11 years. A new boarding procedure now required manifest verification before any seat dispute could be escalated. A restructured complaint filing system routed all first-class complaints to a central review board rather than to route supervisors. Sophia Reyes was permanently appointed senior purser for the London Heathrow route 8 weeks after the flight. She was also invited to contribute to the design of Pinnacle's new crew training module, which used a simplified account of what had happened on Flight 112 as a central case study. The module was called Protocol Exists for a Reason. On a Tuesday morning in late autumn, Naomi Reeves walked through Terminal 4 at JFK for the first time since Flight 112. She was dressed differently. Dark blazer, slim trousers, the COO credentials attached to her travel profile. At gate B24, a young flight attendant looked up when Naomi arrived at the front of the priority boarding lane, looked at the boarding pass, and smiled with the particular ease of someone who has not yet learned to manage warmth out of professional caution. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Reeves," she said. "Seat 1A is ready for you." Naomi stepped through the door. She turned left. She found the seat without looking at the numbers. She put her tote in the overhead bin, sat down, and opened the window shade. The tarmac was bright under the morning sun, and ground crews were moving beneath the wings in orange vests. She reached into her tote and took out her novel. She found her page. She sat in seat 1A, and she read. She did not sit down to prove she belonged. She sat down because she always had. It just took a long time for everyone else to catch up. True power does not announce itself. It does not shout, and it does not beg, and it does not explain itself to rooms that have already made up their minds. Dr. Naomi Reeves sat in that seat for 30 minutes while the world tried to move her, and she did not move. Not because she had a title, because she knew who she was long before the captain said her name out loud. If you have ever been told you were in the wrong room, the wrong seat, the wrong life, and you stayed anyway, this story is yours. If this story moved you, please give it a like right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps more people find stories like this one. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We read every single one. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next story.